Zuleikha, for accepting our invitation to be at Kitchen to Kacheri's public programming. Over to you.
Okay, thank you for inviting me, and it's been a pleasure to look around, to look at two of the archives in some detail. So essentially I'm a theatre director, and I also now run the Alkazi Theatre Archives. So just for a little bit of background, the Alkazi Foundation for the Arts is an umbrella institute. We're located in Greater Kailash 2. We house two archives there. One is the Alkazi collection of photography, and now also the Alkazi Theatre Archives. So I'd like to refer to some of the material here that I've responded to, and I'll come back to an introduction, I suppose, a little through that. So I actually responded to the title here, which is My Father's Mother, and also to this sentence, I wonder why she did not leave some words for us. And so it made me actually think about my grandfather, so my mother's father, and also somehow this question of I wonder why he did not leave some words for us. So my grandfather was Ebrahim Alkazi. He was a well-known theatre person up until the late 70s. He was the head of the National School of Drama for many years. He then sort of left the theatre to start an art collection, a visual arts collection, a painting collection, painting, sculpture and ceramics predominantly, and had an art gallery which he ran with his wife, my grandmother, called Art Heritage, which still exists, and is at Triveni Kalasangam. He then moved on to building a collection of 19th century photography. So the archive that is one of the archives that is housed is that collection, the collection which he built, which is the Alkazi collection of photography, which is sort of overseen by my youngest brother Rahab. It is 19th century photographs from South Asia predominantly, and has been in existence for about 12 years plus. The theatre archives which I run was not formed by him or thought of by him. It is something that came into existence about 5 years ago. And so the reason why this sentence struck me, I wonder why she did not leave some words for us, is because my relationship to my grandfather was actually a very formal one. He was a very formal presence in our lives. We talked about, or he talked about, because it was an extremely formal relationship. So there were no conversations, there were like monologues and seminars on books, but really on art. So the time that I spent with him was always about going through some exhibition, mostly in London, and so he'd be explaining all this, he'd be explaining art. And in some ways it's interesting to me because this wasn't a very personal relationship. There were really no personal words, I suppose, that were left, which is why I responded to why did he not leave any words for us. And it's an interesting way for me to think about what I do, whether it is as a theatre director, whether it is as now at the archive, because in a way, looking and my memory of conversations with him, and he never talked about theatre at all to me. The only thing he said to me about theatre was, "Don't do it." And that was pretty much it. He never said anything else about the theatre. But what he did leave behind, and so what I am, in fact, every day sort of surrounded with, is all these things that his collections. And of course there are words, and of course he did write many personal words, but that is something that my mother, his daughter, really engages with. My engagement I'm not necessarily that interested either very much in his history, because my grandfather's family was originally from Saudi. He was born in Pune. They came to India. He was born in Pune, and he was born and he was brought up there. He studied there, and a big part of his theatre work was done in Bombay before he moved to Delhi to take over the National School of Drama. His family during partition moved to Pakistan, and then subsequently to different parts of the Middle East. He chose to stay behind, and I think it's interesting to think about his theatre work at that time. His becoming the head of the National School of Drama was very much part of nation building at that time. That was sort of the framework of it, and it was a framework he deeply believed in. He deeply believed in the idea of what India meant, and so some part of my growing up years was always about what it means to be here, and his desire, particularly with the photography archive, because these were all collections he sourced that were brought back, from different parts of the world, and he built a huge archive, which was for him always about making this material available here for people to access that history. What does it mean to look at a 19th century photograph sitting in London? But how does one read that image when you bring it back here? How is it made available? So this question of putting, I suppose in some way, it's not so much that it's not my grandfather in himself who interests me. It's actually what he put together, because it's interesting to know someone, even if it was not my grandfather, to know someone who was deeply interested in theatre, deeply committed to that form, who then moved on to the visual arts, although initially he was interested in, he was an artist himself. He moved on to the visual arts and then moved on to photography. And so what remained of him, in a way, is sort of a very kind of a very large sort of framework, actually. And the idea of what it means. So I was interested in the idea of how does one connect all this? Like, why did one man, what compelled him, or what interested in him enough to kind of devote large parts of his time and his energy and passion, to these three things? Did he ever in his work connect them? And in what were the connectivities for him? This is something he really didn't talk about at all. In the last couple of years of his life, I was sitting with him and we were going through one of the books published by the photography collection. And so I asked him, why did you collect photographs? And what is the link to theatre? And he just said, and by this time he was losing his memory, he just said, but isn't it the same thing? And I found that as a really interesting way to connect, as a connectivity. I think what is interesting to me is theatre for me is a question of relationalities. How do you relate to the world? Not just in process, because of course it's very much about that. How do you know, it's always a very large number of people working together. You're all committed towards a singular idea, and you believe in that idea for that time, which is the production. And that's how you come together. But there's content, which is also about relationalities between people, between peoples and places, because this is what stories are about. And so for me, it's about process and content and ways that we position ourselves in the world and we relate to the world. And it's always different and it's always shifting. And that, for me, is what is interesting. So I came to, actually, I was telling you that I actually came to the question of the archive around 2010. And so till this time, actually, I had never been to the Alkazi Foundation for the Arts. I had never seen the photographic collection at all. And somehow I can't remember exactly why. I came across this image which I thought I would bring to show you. I came across this image. This is an image taken by Felice Beato in 1858. He was a Italian war photographer, and this is one of the sites of the mutiny, of the uprising, of the first war of independence. This is taken in Sikandrabad. This image is taken about 4 or 5 months actually after the shooting here took place. And this was an interesting image because, of course, at that time all photography was staged. But it was just for me a very unusual image because of the way that there are these 3 men, and then there is the horse, and then of course there are all these bones in the foreground. And so I was just interested in the idea of staging and stillness. And at that time it was just simply looking at theatre and photography. And because both are about moments, but what they mean in both practices are very different. There is a moment in the theatre, right? But it's not, it feels still, but of course it's not still. And then of course there's photography. So I came to the archive. That was actually the first time I literally stepped foot in the archive. And I went on to make a performance piece based on this image, which is really about the act of staging and what that means. It was also an important work for me because a lot of it was very much about when you actually try and begin to put performers into this, to kind of reenact these 4 men, you begin to have questions, or I did, about the nature of acting and who is the performer, and what is the role of the performer, and what is the quality of the performer, and what is the performer as a medium, because that's what theatre, one of the elements of theatre is the performer, and the performer is very much a medium that you learn as a director to work with. I then came, once I finished this work, I then went back to the archive to work on another album. This is these two. two images from that album. You can take a look. This is an album of photographs that were used in evidence in a court case that happened in I've spent 5 years on this production and I can't remember the years. It was a 16-year-long court case, 1936, 1920 to 1936. So in the court, the case was about, there's a large estate in Bengal, there was a large estate in undivided Bengal called the Bhaval estate, owned by 3 brothers. The middle brother apparently dies. 16 years later, there is a sadhu who shows up in Dhaka and says, I am this man. The Bhaval estate was actually like a small kingdom, so it was a very large estate. In this time, the other 2 brothers have died. The estate has been taken over by the British Court of Wards. The wife says his wife is alive. The wife said, this man died in front of my eyes, so it can't possibly be him. And he says, well, it is him. So there begins a long court case between him and pretty much the state, because it is with the British Court of Wards. And there is a 16-year-long case about who this man is. What is the identity of this man? And so the photographs we have are from one book of images that were used as evidence in court. And so I was very interested. I became interested, of course, in the fact of this question of how does one say who one is, right? And of course, it's very much also to do with biometrics and, how does the state choose to define you? How does an individual choose to define themselves? And of course, this question of the imposter is very much to do also with an actor. And that's why I started working with this material. The material took many iterations and ended up as a trial with 2 lawyers and a judge, staged by me, with a series of expert witnesses. So there were photographers, there was an anthropologist, there was a sociologist, and there were 2 actors also. And that was one of the other ways that I came to this archive and sort of began a kind of engagement, the engagement of putting actually theatre together with photography in some way, in one part, to think about actually this question of history. And that was something when I now look back on my grandfather's major works as a director, they were all about history. They were all about being staged at the Purana Killa, and it was very much about the site, it was very much about the story, it's very much about a kind of, there's the broader history and historical moment that you're in, and then the person in that. So the personal histories and larger histories. And that to me was also connections that I made with the photography archive for sure. In the sense of how does one read images, right? How does one think about history? And what does alternate history actually mean? One of the interesting things that happened was, so I found all the actual testimonies from this case at the British Library because I couldn't locate them in Calcutta. And it's like some 30,000 pages, and when you read it, it's one thing. When somebody speaks it out, it's a completely different experience, because it is in perspective somehow, the personal with the larger, because you understand this is a particular moment in time. This is just pre-independence. The last case, the last trial happens just pre-independence, and so already there is a lot happening around with the independence movement that contextualizes why this man won the case all 3 times. It goes from the lower court in Dhaka, in Calcutta, to the higher court in Dhaka, to the Privy Council. He wins all 3 times, despite the fact that the wife said it's not him, and that he's died in front of me. And so you begin to try and understand why was this judgment. And when you begin to read around what was happening at the time, you begin to understand what went into play. The British were already leaving to begin with, and so whatever revenue the British Court of Wards was getting from this, in any case, they would not have access to, as even just a basic putting together of facts. So as a theatre director, I see the photography archive particularly, I think, as a library of scripts. And so my work as a theatre director has come out of this archive more and more. Some part of it, but I would say a significant part of it has come out from this archive. Because I'm interested actually in this kind of tension. There's a deep relationship for me between theatre and history, and I'm interested in those kind of linkages. As a kind of a basic proposition for myself. At the time that I was working on this project is the time when this question of a theatre archive came up. So the theatre archive as it stands, the Alkazi Theatre Archives, we have material from post-independence, modern Indian theatre, predominantly. One part of that collection is Alkazi's own theatre work, of course, but we have a significant amount of other material in the form of important theatre journals in different languages. We have a lot of newspaper clippings, we have a lot of seminar papers that are actually very, very important to also understand that the questions one is engaged with in theatre today are actually seem to have been engaged with over time. We have, of course, brochures, invites, things like that. We're currently in the middle of archiving and of digitizing and cataloging Jannatya Manch's own archives, and Survi Theatre, which is a old family-run theatre in Hyderabad. So that's what we're doing. My interest in theatre materials is, I would say, only partly in the history and form of the practice itself, of theatre itself. What I'm largely interested in is, can one look at theatre as a social document? So when you look at plays, what kind of stories does it tell of its time? So for example, what kind of a narrative of the labor movement do you get from looking at Jannatya Manch's plays, right? In relationship to the history that we know, in relationship to event. So what we do begin with always is looking at what's happening at the time in terms of political, social events, what are public policies at the time, what are events, and then try and understand the material, the theatre material that we're looking at in relationship to this, to understand what kind of histories of, what kind of justice does theatre actually talk about. For example, that's one of the things that we're looking at now. When one looks at theatre, there's also who is watching these plays, who's watching plays. So if you're looking at a particular play, who's watching the play, where did it travel, who funded the play, and then of course to look at the play itself to see what is the play actually saying about an event that it was just, why is this play important, and then of course there's the question of the canon, which there is one, and then there are, when you begin to make maps, which we do. So for example, we're making a map of theatre in the 90s in India, because there is no material about it. It is a period that's very important to me because it was the time I worked. It was just after I came out of college. I used to be a lighting designer, and so I worked with a range of people, traveled a lot. And of course, it's a very important time because this is the moment of liberalization. This is the time when, there are festivals of India. This is the moment when people start traveling abroad to show their work. So, for example, we're making a map. The map consists of, what are significant events that happened in the 90s, what are public policies. Because we're looking at liberalization, we're also looking at economic policies in great detail. Not that happened here, but also in terms of broader sort of shifts globally. Then we're looking at what theatre festivals existed, what new plays were written, who funded this, where did they travel, and of course then what is the content, but primarily also to see who was watching these plays. There are some plays that happened, there were one show or two shows, but they seem to have been very important. So why was that? So my interest is to look at materials surrounding. It's not the play itself. It's sort of the kind of the systems that were deployed, the seminars that were happening, because television and television particularly is, very much happening, and what does that do to theatre actually? There were, in the 90s, there were huge mega productions, The Legend of Ram, Lilette did Jaya, Mahabharat. So there was this kind of magnum opus that was also happening. Some of which I was a part of as a lighting designer, but it's interesting, the scale is interesting, right? It's also interesting, for example, that tickets cost like crazy amounts of money, and for that time. We now assume that people will charge you 2,000 rupees for a ticket. This was the cusp. It didn't happen before that, right? There's something that was happening in terms of corporate funding, private funding coming in, corporate sponsorship of festivals that were coming in, because there's a shift, in the sort of the framing. Sorry, I can go on about this, whatever. So broadly to say that my interest is really in this, and is really because theatre is really all about, is in itself, it's a social activity, as everybody says, but for me that means that it's really about people talking to other people, right? There is the person who decided to do this play and then had, a range of people involved in it. These are all a set of people talking to another set of people who are the audience. It's a conversation. And what is being said in this conversation, what value does it have? And which time is it talking to? Because while theatre is made very much in this moment, is it looking back? Is it looking at its moment? Or is it in doing this also looking a little bit towards what's to come? Theatre is a mirror to reality, as one says. But I think there are different ways to think about that, and there are so many essential questions about representation. How do you represent the world? This is the fundamental thing that theatre deals with. How do you represent the world? And in answering that single question, there are hundreds of other questions, I feel, right? How can a city-born actor, for example, play somebody from the village? It's actually a very practical, actorly question, right? But in thinking about this question, there are a whole range of other questions come up, which in many ways we are talking about today, right? When one is talking about micro-histories and representation, this is something that it's actually the same question. And so for me, this set of questions is what is interesting to me about the theatre. This set of questions is also in relationship to where I started, which is my grandfather, because he answered those questions to his time. And in many ways, the difference between him and me, there's a big difference between the way we ask the same questions in a way, and I suppose that's also natural, but I suppose the framework of those set of questions is perhaps similar. I just also want to say that this box is, of course, interesting to me because it is an archive, or the beginning of an archive of two actresses. And of course, this is very interesting to me because coming from my frame, working with trials and using the actor as a witness, this is always my interest. My interest is what kind of a witness is the actor. My interest is what kind of knowledge does an actor produce? Does the actor produce any kind of knowledge at all? In terms of their own process, in terms of the fact that the actor's body is an archive. And one knows that with more, with forms like Kathakali or Yakshagan, but what kind of an archive is a contemporary actor's form is a very, very difficult question that has been engaged with to, I think, no real resolution here in this country, because I feel that sort of kind of a modern or a contemporary sensibility with bodies that have very different kinds of histories. Everybody's body is such a particular history of how they sit, where their family is from. All this is part of the way, how you sit, how you stand. And that's something that an actor is always engaged with all the time because that is their instrument. And so, of course, I was very curious about this as well for that, because I'm interested in just the actor, their processes, and really how they engage with their own selves and their own histories. How do they engage with their time? And of course, because they're engaging with the character, something being outside of themselves, how does one actually, this question of what does it mean to take someone else on, and how do you do that, is actually is a question of our time, right? We're always talking about the other, and how does one understand the other? But it's something that really, that's what the actor does, and I don't believe that it's a question of empathy. It's a question of a dialogue and a particular kind of a dialogue that an actor with his own physical self and their own physical bodies has with what is predominantly a real figure, which is the character. And that, the crossing over, is actually never a crossing over, it's a constant state of dialogue, according to me. And I think this is very valuable for me in understanding, actually, as I said, how does one relate to the world? You know, how does one engage with where we are, you know, the place that we live in, the landscapes that we live in. Yeah.
In fact, I would add to that because this project itself has become very interesting for me to receive. Because when it started, Priyanjoli is dealing with thousands of photographs from Wiener Festwochen archive. We've seen those where the actresses as beautifully dressed up, could be lying on the bed, could be photographed across the mirror, could be in any form, in act. So while we were thinking of the project in terms of archiving, we know what all is possible out of it in terms of its potential. The moment she had to think about bringing it out in the public, somewhere where we agreed on is the question of, I think I've asked you in the seminar also, the agency of the dead, and does she have the right over their physicality to be represented somewhere? They're the most beautiful attires, but a certain kind of a physique which would have been commented on or appreciated, and would they have wanted it to be here? And hence the photograph that she finally selects from these thousands is 4 of her mother only. Because right now she is in relationship with her to be able to take that call.
Right.
So I'm right now just adding to what you are insinuating, which is asking questions about the body itself when it's being presented in an archive, which has come out in this project particularly very strongly.
You asked me one question, which was, so I said that the theatre archive has predominantly, photographs and a lot of print material. I have decided not to collect, I suppose, sets, props, costumes, which I know that a lot of theatre archives do collect. So one of the reasons for that is that I might come around to that, but to me, theatre is not meant to be, in essence, is meant to be ephemeral. I really believe that. Yes, of course, recordings and all of photographs are all important, but in essence, it's not meant to be, it's meant to be repurposed, it's meant to be broken, it's meant to be lost, it's meant to be used as, scrap. It's not meant to remain in that way. A set is not meant to stay on forever. It's meant to move on to become something else. And so, sort of in principle, that's how I currently feel about it. That I think one must document it, but I don't really think one should hold on to it. And if one does, one has to find a mode of holding on to that commensurate to what it is itself. And I don't know what that is at the moment.
So, I'm just forming this question as I'm listening to you the second time, because I have been talking about, in the process of these programs, the need to understand living archives. I'm also myself still trying to, so I don't think I have an answer for it. But where archives become part of the process itself. So, I'm now talking about Niyati's project, where she is reconnecting with her nani through her saris, but she's gone to the extent of wearing one.
I see.
So what happens when you repurpose the material, give it more lives, and that giving it more lives becomes a form of archiving, not just putting it as it is in the closet or in a showcase?
I guess my response would just be this, that it's a question to think about uh, I think it's like when I was doing this project and I had so many testimonies, and this person. So just to say that this is the original Kumar. This is a photograph before he died. This is a photograph of the plaintiff, the guy who came back. And actually this series of photographs is really incredible because it captures him as a sannyasi with his wild hair and loincloth all into this. And this is a staged image just to see how, whether he resembled or not. This is the actor from my project who I inserted. But, when I had to make this into a script and I had to edit, I struggled with it for almost 2 years because I was thinking, like, how does one edit this? Because the story will change I'm already then changing the story. And so the question, I resolved this in a particular way, but it's also the story one wants to tell. So I know that I'm interested, for example, in the records of Jannatya Manch, where they traveled, which was the street theatre festivals that they attended, who were, for example, the other street theatre companies. Because this is material that's actually not written, it's not available. So that is in many ways a priority for me. You know what I mean?
Yes.
The scripts are interesting for me. The photographs are perhaps not as interesting. The scripts are interesting for me because they have versions, and it is through this also when you have the textual material to understand this question of what kind of history are they telling. So my question is, it's a question, I guess, of what story do you want to tell, and that is what you will collect, and you will collect it in the way that you will want to tell that story, if you know what I mean, if you think about the form of that story. So and in some ways I feel this question of dramaturgy and where form and content meet is something that I'm trying to think through, not of course only